Good day and welcome to the weekly COVID-19 update. So this last week of July, we are really starting to look a bit more positive. The data is looking good. I'll show you just now. I'll just go into share my screen, and it is starting to look a lot better. Right, so you can see that the curve of the third wave is really starting to come down. In fact, now it's below the peak of the first wave. So just let me show you where we were last week. You can see we're above the peak of the last week of the first wave last week. So we now certainly have progressed. And this is to a large extent due to Gauteng coming down quite markedly. Remember, Gauteng really was what was driving the national 7-day average of daily cases. But you can see there is quite a hodgepodge, a combination of different provinces, each one having their own characteristics. So this is Gauteng, where we are, and looking very positive. Looking at the Western Cape, they are still, haven't quite plateaued yet. They are still increasing, but should be plateauing fairly soon and then hopefully coming down after that. Eastern Cape still in the early phases, but also starting to kind of inflect and maybe flatten out a bit. KZN, this I think the artifact from the unrest, and now they are coming up quite steeply. So KZN will be a little bit behind the rest with the developing of their third wave. So this is where we are. Our third wave is now starting to mature. Hospital admissions coming down. The death rate does have a bit of a lag, but will start catching up and then afterwards come down again. But we are still fairly high, and I think even though it's coming down, I think we still do need to be very cautious with our precautions. The virus is still around, the transmission is still relatively high, but the news is looking quite good. So where are we with the corona vaccination? How are we progressing towards our endpoint of reaching sufficient vaccination of the adult population to get community immunity, hopefully by the end of the year? So let's look where we are with that. So yesterday, 225,000 doses were administered. I should mention and compliment the base synagogue, who on the weekend immunized just under 3,000 individuals, 3,000 doses were administered. So that's really kind of great news, because really we want to kind of increase, particularly the weekend vaccination. This is one of the problems at the moment, that vaccines are only mainly given between Monday and Friday nationally. So this needs to kind of catch up as well. But the vaccinations are increasing quite steeply, just under 7 million doses now, mainly in Gauteng, KZN, and Western Cape. And how is it distributed? Well, 1.3 million of Johnson & Johnson vaccines. I mean, that's a single dose for completion of vaccination, and 5.5 million of Pfizer doses. 4.2 individuals have been partially immunized, and the 1.273 fully immunized with Pfizer vaccines. So I think this is really what we want to look at. What is the status as of yesterday? 6.5% of the adult population have been fully vaccinated. In other words, have either received one dose of Johnson & Johnson or the 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccination, 4.3% of the total population. Partially vaccinated, in other words, has received 1 dose of Pfizer, 10.7%, 7.1% of the total population. And to see how we progressed, this is a week ago, 4.7% of the adult population, 2 weeks ago, 3.6%, and similarly for the total population, 3.2, 2.4, up to 4.3%, and partially vaccinated from 7.7% 2 weeks ago, 9.2% a week ago, up to 10.7%. So we are moving along, still quite a long way to go, but we are moving along quite well. We're talking about partial vaccine. I just want to show you this slide. I showed it 2 weeks ago, but let me repeat it again. If you received 1 dose of Pfizer, the protection against any disease, any clinical disease, and when you talk about symptomatic, it's mainly mild disease, it's not so great. But when we come up to a single dose to prevent serious disease, hospitalization, and so on, even a single dose will be 94% protective. So if we go back to where we were before, 10.7% of individuals will now be protected from severe disease over and above those who've had natural immunity from previous infection. So way to go, but we are moving in the right direction, and it should start manifesting pretty soon in the reduction of severe disease. So let's talk about some of the questions. And I'm very grateful for the many questions that have come. Obviously, I can really only do some of them, but I wanted to spend a bit of time today on talking on what's become very topical and it's been very much in the news, and also a lot of questions come in, and that's the issue of ivermectin. Ivermectin. A few months ago, it was hydroxychloroquine. Maybe a year ago, hydroxychloroquine was the kind of drug which is going to be a wonder miracle cure. Now it's ivermectin. And I often get asked this question. The medical profession, the scientific profession say, look, there's no evidence that ivermectin works, but why not give it anyway? So I just want to kind of give the background to ivermectin, to hydroxychloroquine, to colchicine, and many of these other drugs, which are touted to be miracle cures, either for prevention or for treatment of the illness. Now, you know, when COVID first started, of course, like HIV before it and other viral diseases, there's a frantic search for drugs which are going to affect the virus. You're going to directly knock out the virus. We do have other treatments like oxygen and cortisone and so on for management. Those are symptomatic. We treat the symptoms and hope the body's then going to overcome the viral infection. So what scientists have done and what medical professions have done is looked at various other drugs, what they're called repurposing drugs, drugs which have been designed for a particular purpose, and see, do they have any effect on limiting or getting rid of the virus infection as such. And in fact, there have been many of these. There have been dozens and dozens of these repurposed drugs which are being looked at. I've got 3 pages of these various drugs. There's ivermectin over there. And they first looked at various antiviral drugs, drugs which are used, for example, for treatment of HIV, and ribavirin, and leponavir, ritonavir, and many other drugs. And when they do the studies, they've shown that there hasn't really been any clinical effect. Various anti-malarial drugs, and that's where hydroxychloroquine comes in, also tovaquone, artemisinin, and many other drugs like that. Looked at various oncological drugs used in the treatment of cancer, because all of these do have a mechanism of action, which I said, well, if it's got a mechanism of action against other viruses or other parasites or treatment of cancer, maybe it'll also have the same effect on viruses. And unfortunately, that hasn't really, even in fact, even Viagra has been touted as a possible cure, but obviously all of these have shown not to be any clinical effect. In fact, even the company itself, which makes ivermectin, which is Merck, they've put out this statement saying that there's no scientific base for potential therapeutic effect against COVID-19, no meaningful evidence of clinical activity, and a concerning lack of safety data in the majority of studies. So we do hear of what we call anecdotal reports. Many a doctor will say, yeah, they've treated a patient with ivermectin and they got better. Or they treated even a family and they got better. But you must remember, the only way you can really establish, does a drug in fact have a clinical effect, is by doing a clinical trial. And the clinical trial measures the potential drug against what's called a placebo, in other words, a dummy drug. And then you can show it does in fact have an effect or not. And there have been limited trials. Unfortunately, some of them where they've said that there has been effect they've really been very poorly controlled trials, very poor data, and they've really actually been dismissed. One or two well-controlled trials have shown that there's no clinical effect. So even though there's anecdotal reports, an anecdotal report, particularly of an illness which is going to get better anyway, doesn't really have any meaning, doesn't have any value at all. So I thought I'd put to rest the ivermectin. Of course, the one question which may come about is that a lot of people say, well, why not give it a try? You know, there can be no harm. The problem is there can be harm. There's two harms. The one harm is that people get the impression that it may work, and therefore they delay going to hospital or going under proper medical treatment. And this delay, of course, the disease can advance and itself can be harmful. The other thing is that drugs such as ivermectin are not totally innocuous. They do have side effects. They can be toxic, particularly if they're used in high doses. And there have been a number of hospitals which have reported patients coming in with quite marked, quite advanced COVID disease who've been on ivermectin. They've delayed coming in to hospital. And also they've had toxic effects. Liver failure is one of them, kidney failure as a result of using relatively high doses of ivermectin. So all of these other drugs, in fact, unfortunately, don't have any therapeutic place in treating COVID and can be harmful. And people should be discouraged from using them until there is evidence. And if evidence does come about that there is a clinical efficacy proven by clinical trial, then of course one can reevaluate it. So unfortunately, I know we've run a bit out of time, so I won't be able to go through many of the other questions, but I thought I would spend time because that's quite important and we had quite a lot of questions on it. Next week, I'll deal with pregnancy. There have been a lot of questions from women, either who are planning pregnancy or who are pregnant or are breastfeeding. I'll give the bottom line is that at the moment, really people who are pregnant, women who are pregnant, are encouraged to be vaccinated, but I'll qualify it and I'll give a bit of the background next week. Also talk about some of the side effects and also some of the more serious side effects, which are very rare, the blood clots, the inflammation of the heart and so on. So I'll deal with that in a bit more detail next week. So thank you very much and all the best. Bye-bye.